Welcome in, everyone. Today we're diving into some seriously mind-bending stuff with AI researcher Dr. Jos Bach.
Yeah, we're talking about the nature of reality itself, consciousness, artificial intelligence.
It's going to be a wild ride, so buckle up.
Basically, Dr. Bach's big idea is that what we experience as reality, it's not the actual physical world, but a simulation.
A simulation created by our own brains. Kind of blows your mind, right?
It does. And we're going deep on two of his talks. One, a casual conversation, and the other, a more structured podcast interview.
Both fascinating in their own way.
And through both, Dr. Bach, he doesn't just throw out this simulation idea and then leave us hanging.
Right. He breaks down why he believes this and what it could mean, for everything. How we see ourselves, artificial intelligence, even the nature of consciousness.
Totally. It challenges so much of what we take for granted.
So if we're living in a simulation, how's our brain pulling it off? It's not like we're all walking around with, wires plugged in or something.
But right, exactly. It's not the Matrix.
Yeah.
Dr. Bach, he compares the brain to a data compressor.
Okay, data compression.
Yep.
I'm listening, but my brain might need to compress that analogy a bit.
Think of it like this. Every single second, your senses are getting bombarded with tons of information, right? Sights, sounds, smells.
It's a lot.
It is. And all of that is raw data. Your brain's job, it has to find the patterns in that data, like what's important, what's not, and then it creates a simplified model. And that model, that becomes your reality.
So it's kind of like a highlight reel, not the whole movie.
Exactly. It's efficient.
But also kind of freaky when you think about it. Instead of remembering every single detail, every leaf on every tree.
Your brain is like, yep, that's generally what trees look like, and moves on.
And that frees up space for other stuff.
Right, exactly. It's all about efficiency. And it's not just random, this system. Dr. Bach suggests that there might be a universality hypothesis at play here.
Okay, universality hypothesis, another big word. What's that mean?
Basically, the idea is that brains, whether they're human brains or animal brains, they might develop similar structures when they're exposed to similar things in the world.
So my dog and I might experience the world really differently, but there's some overlap in how our brains actually process all of it.
Potentially. We're probably not having existential debates with our pets, but...
Not yet, at least.
Right. But there could be some shared foundation in how we perceive reality.
So then the question becomes, if it's all a simulation, why does my simulation feel so different from yours?
That's a great point.
Why do I love spicy food when some people think it's like torture? We're both running the human experience program, but our settings seem pretty customizable.
I like that, the human experience program. But you're right, those customizations, they come from our unique genes, experiences, memories, all of the things that shape our individual models.
Okay, so even with our differences, the way that our brain builds these models, the underlying process, might be surprisingly similar.
Exactly, and that's where Dr. Bach's analogy of the Hundefutter factory comes in.
Okay, the Hundefutter factory, lay it on me. I'm ready to clock in.
So imagine this. Each neuron, those tiny brain cells, they're like dogs in this factory.
My brain is a dog factory. I knew I liked dogs for a reason.
Right. And these aren't just any dogs, they're specialized. Each one has a specific job to do.
Okay, so what are they actually doing in there?
Some of the dogs, they bark signals to other dogs. Some receive those barks, and then you've got these other cells called glial cells. They're like the managers, making sure everything runs smoothly.
So I've got this whole canine operation going on in my head.
Kind of, yeah. And the barking, that's how the neurons actually communicate.
Sending signals back and forth.
Exactly. And the more those dogs bark together, the stronger their connection becomes.
So it's the more I do something, the louder those specific dogs bark.
Yes. And the stronger that connection gets, the more that behavior or skill or thought pattern, whatever, becomes ingrained.
Like training my inner dog team.
That's it. And it's just such a cool way to visualize this complex thing, this adaptable organ in our heads. But here's where things get really interesting, because Dr. Bach suggests that this same understanding of how the brain works, this pattern recognition, this learning through data compression, we can apply this to AI.
Okay, so we went from my brain as a dog factory building a simulation to the robots coming for our jobs.
Well, not robots exactly, but
that?
AI that learns in ways that might surprise you. Think about something like ChatGPT, right? Which seems so smart on the surface. But Dr. Bach would argue that it's actually a really, really sophisticated autocomplete system.
Wait, seriously? So all those times I've been blown away by ChatGPT, it's basically just really good at predicting the next word.
Pretty much. I mean, it's been trained on this massive amount of text data, finding patterns and probabilities in how words are used. It's not that it understands the meaning behind those words like we do. Not really. It's more like it's playing this really, really advanced statistics game.
Okay. That is both impressive and slightly disappointing at the same time.
I know. But even if it's just stats, the scale at which these AI models work is incredible. Training something like ChatGPT costs millions of dollars in computing power.
Millions of dollars.
It's true. I mean, we're talking Hollywood film budget levels of investment.
I guess my brain's Hundred Futter factory is a little more cost-effective then.
For sure.
But seriously, that kind of investment for AI, it makes you wonder, what's the end game here?
It's the billion-dollar question.
Are we just building really, really good autocomplete? Or is this leading somewhere bigger?
That's what we're trying to figure out. And Dr. Bach, he has some really intriguing ideas and some that are kind of unsettling about where this might all be going. It might not be killer robots we need to worry about, but something much stranger.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Stranger in what way?
Instead of picturing, like, humanoid robots taking over, Dr. Bach says, think more along the lines of these vast, interconnected AI systems.
Interconnected how?
Think systems so integrated into our lives that we're not just interacting with them, but we're almost living inside of them.
Living inside AI. Okay, that sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
Right.
But this is a deep dive, so I know it's probably more nuanced than that.
It's not about being physically plugged in, like in the Matrix or anything.
Okay, good.
It's more about our relationship to technology in general. Like, think about how connected you are already to your phone.
Oh, I know. I spend way too much time on this thing.
Right, but now imagine that connection amplified like 1,000 times over. AI systems managing things like traffic flow, healthcare, even personalized recommendations.
Okay, so AI is making our lives easier, but...
But it's also shaping our experiences in ways that we might not even realize, right?
Exactly. And if our brains are already in the business of creating these simulations, like we talked about, then how different is that from living inside AI's version of reality?
That's the big question, isn't it? And Dr. Bach would argue that this is precisely why understanding our own minds is so crucial, especially now.
Okay, I'm with you on that. Because if we don't even understand how our own brains work, how susceptible they are to influence, and how are we supposed to navigate this future where AI is calling more and more of the shots?
Exactly. I mean, think about how easily we're swayed by things like advertising or targeted content online.
Oh, don't even get me started. I swear my phone is listening to me.
Right. So now imagine AI systems that are specifically designed to understand and even predict those patterns in our thinking.
Like having a superpowered marketing team inside your head 24/7.
In a way, yes. And they're constantly refining their strategies based on what our Hundefutter factories, as Dr. Bach would call them, are most likely to believe.
It's kind of terrifying when you put it like that. So what are we supposed to do? Should we all just unplug and move off the grid?
Well, Dr. Bach doesn't necessarily advocate for that. But he does raise some really important questions about the cost of intelligence itself. Like, he talks about how human intelligence, it took a really long time to evolve, right? And it left us super vulnerable in those early years as babies and children.
Yeah, we're not exactly born ready to take on the world.
Exactly. So he asks, is intelligence really the winning strategy in the grand scheme of things? Like, yeah, we've achieved some amazing things, but we've also created a lot of problems.
That we have. And now we're creating AI that could potentially outsmart us, maybe even outmaneuver us. It's kind of a scary thought.
It is. And the development of AI is happening at warp speed compared to human evolution. So Dr. Bach asks, are we really equipped to handle this? I mean, we're only just beginning to understand our own minds, let alone something as complex as AI.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. We've got brains simulating reality, AI potentially surpassing human intelligence, the future of consciousness itself. I'm not going to lie, my brain is kind of hurting right now.
I hear you. It's a lot to process. But to bring it back down to earth a little bit, how does all of this relate to, like, me, the person listening to this deep dive?
Yeah, how does any of this apply to my everyday life?
That's where things get really interesting, because Dr. Bach argues that understanding this idea of the illusion of the self, this concept we touched on earlier, it can be incredibly freeing.
Okay, rewind for me. How is realizing that my sense of self is an illusion
Yeah.
a good thing? It sounds kind of depressing, if I'm being honest.
It might seem that way at first, but think of it this way. If you're completely identified with every single thought that pops into your head, every fear, every insecurity, then you're kind of at their mercy, right?
Yeah, it's like being on a roller coaster that you can't get off of.
Exactly. But if you can start to see those thoughts and feelings as simply mental events as simulations and not necessarily the truth of who you are, then you gain some distance.
So it's less about being a passenger in my own head and more like I'm learning to drive.
Exactly. You're starting to take control of the steering wheel. And this is where Dr. Bach talks about those glimpses of transcendence that he's experienced.
Glimpses of transcendence. You're going to have to break that one down for me.
Have you ever had those moments where you're so absorbed in something, music, nature, a deep conversation, that your sense of self kind of fades away?
Oh, yeah, totally. Like when I'm playing guitar, it's like nothing else exists in those moments.
That's it. He says those are hints of what's possible, these moments of expanded awareness. And some spiritual traditions, through practices like meditation or mindfulness, they've been trying to tap into that more intentionally for centuries.
So you're saying that meditation isn't just about relaxation or stress reduction, but it could actually be about expanding our awareness to include this larger field of consciousness.
That's exactly what Dr. Bach is suggesting. And it's not just meditation. Even things like psychedelics, used in the right context, can induce these kinds of transcendent experiences.
Okay, got to pause there for a second. Just to be clear, we're not advocating for anyone to go out and experiment with psychedelics.
Absolutely. Critical thinking is key.
Safety first, people.
But the point is, if our sense of self is itself a kind of simulation, then maybe it's not as fixed as we think it is.
It's more like a work in progress.
Exactly. Yeah. Something that we can learn to work with more consciously.
Okay, my mind is officially blown again. So, to bring it back down to earth one more time, how does any of this help me deal with, like, the stress of daily life? You know, my to-do list, that tough conversation I'm dreading.
I love that you ask that because that's the power of all of this. It's not just some abstract philosophical debate. It can actually change how we approach our lives.
So how?
Remember those negative thought patterns Dr. Bach was talking about?
Right.
The ones where our brains get stuck in these unhelpful simulations?
Oh, yeah. Like when I'm convinced that a presentation is going to be a total disaster before I even step foot in the room.
Exactly. And then it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Mm-hmm. The worst.
But understanding that those thoughts are just that, thoughts, simulations, not facts. It gives you a little bit of wiggle room.
It's like realizing that just because my brain is telling me a story doesn't mean that story is true.
Exactly. You can choose to engage with those thoughts differently, maybe even rewire those thought patterns altogether.
It's like my inner dog team. They're used to running this one particular drill that always leads to the same outcome. But I can be like, okay, team, new drill, new outcome we're aiming for.
I love that. And Dr. Bach would argue that recognizing the shared nature of this simulated reality, how interconnected we all are, can also be a game changer.
Okay, interconnectedness. That's another one for the list of big words. What do you mean by that?
Well, if we're all running our own individual simulations, but those simulations are built on this foundation of shared laws of physics, shared biology, shared cultural influences even, then there's a common ground there, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that makes sense. But how does that translate to everyday life?
He even goes as far as suggesting that there might be something like a collective consciousness that we're all tapping into.
Wait, hold on. Collective consciousness. Are we talking about telepathy now?
He's not talking about reading each other's minds or anything like that. It's more subtle than that. Think of it like, have you ever walked into a room and just felt a certain vibe? Or finished someone's sentence who you're really in sync with?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's like when I'm jamming with my bandmates and it feels like we're all in this groove, tapping into something beyond just the individual parts.
Exactly. And he points to things like mirror neurons in our brains, which fire both when we do something and when we watch someone else do that same thing. It's like our brains are wired for connection, for shared experience.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
We are social creatures after all. But if there is this collective aspect to consciousness, what does that even mean for me on a daily basis?
That's the million-dollar question, and one that Dr. Bach leaves open-ended. But he does suggest that if our thoughts, our feelings, our actions, if they're all contributing to this larger field of consciousness, then our choices matter even more than we realize.
So it's not just about my individual simulation, but how that simulation interacts with and influences the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because it ties into questions of ethics, responsibility, and the future of humanity in a whole new light. We're exploring this idea that our individual realities or simulations, they might be feeding into something much larger, this collective consciousness.
Yeah, and I got to be honest, part of me is still kind of like, okay, but how much of this is theoretical? How much is like backed up by actual science?
Totally fair question. And Dr. Bach, he's Not saying that it's definitively proven or anything, but he does point to some pretty interesting research. Like, he talks about how our Western culture, we tend to be so focused on individual achievement, right?
Yeah, the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality.
Exactly. And he suggests that this hyper focus on the individual, it might actually be blinding us to these more subtle connections that exist between minds.
So it's like our obsession with me, myself, and I is preventing us from seeing the bigger picture.
It's a possibility, yeah. And he even points to other cultures, ones that place a stronger emphasis on community, on shared rituals, things like that. He suggests that they might be more tuned in to these collective aspects of consciousness.
Interesting. It's like we're so busy trying to stand out from the crowd that we forget that we're part of the crowd to begin with.
And that right there, that's the heart of it. If there's any truth to this idea of a collective consciousness, however it works, then it means that our actions, our thoughts, even our emotions, they all have this ripple effect. They go beyond just our own little bubbles.
Okay, so it's like my good vibes can actually impact the people around me, which is awesome. But then my bad day, could that actually bring everyone else down too? That's kind of a lot of pressure.
It's a both-and situation for sure. And Dr. Bach, he doesn't shy away from those ethical implications either. He actually argues that this is exactly why it's so important for us to be grappling with these mind-bending concepts, especially now as we're on the verge of all this new technology and advancement.
So it's not just about, like, pondering the mysteries of the universe for fun.
Not just that.
It's about how we treat each other, how we act in the world, knowing that we might be influencing this larger web of consciousness.
Exactly. It's like if you know that your actions are sending ripples out into the world, you're going to be a lot more mindful of what you're tossing into the pond, right?
That makes sense. But let's be real for a second. Even if I buy into this whole collective consciousness idea, most people, they're just trying to get through their day. You know, they aren't thinking about these grand universal concepts. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we take these big ideas and apply them to everyday life?
I think that's where it gets really practical. Dr. Bach, he suggests that certain practices like meditation, mindfulness, things that help to quiet the me noise, he says that these practices might actually be training our minds to tap into this interconnected space, this collective consciousness.
So it's not just about relaxation or stress reduction. It's potentially about expanding our awareness to include this larger field of consciousness, this interconnectedness.
Exactly. It's like we've been given these incredible brains capable of amazing things, but we're only using a tiny fraction of their potential.
It's true when you really think about it. Okay, so if we can train our brains to be more aware of this interconnectedness, what does that actually look like in the real world? I mean, what would that change?
That's the million-dollar question. It's uncharted territory in a lot of ways, but Dr. Bach, he hints at things like greater empathy, more ethical decision-making, even solutions to global problems that we can't even imagine yet.
So this whole deep dive, it wasn't just about questioning the nature of reality. It was about questioning what's possible for humanity, especially if we can learn to tap into this interconnected potential.
Exactly. It's a call to action in a way.
It is. And on that note, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today.
Definitely. We've only just scratched the surface.
True. But if you're anything like me, your brain is probably already working overtime with all of these ideas. Big thanks to Dr. Jos Bach for giving us so much to think about. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll catch you next time for another mind-bending exploration.